So instead of me trying to introduce each of you, I think it would be great if we could start off with a little introduction and kind of how did you get into cybersecurity?
So, I'm Jennifer Napper. I joined the Army before most of y'all were born in 1980, and didn't really understand what I was getting myself into, but I went into the communications field. So the communications field back then included things like switchboards and radio communications and push-to-talk. And then over the years, what we found is that, you know, those little networks of radio networks grew into having more computers on them and changed dramatically. And so you find yourself going from, you know, 1950s technology in the Army in 1980 to, you know, more putting LANs through ceilings in the 1990s and things that we shouldn't have been doing. But that technology change continued to expedite and go faster and faster. And it became more and more interesting to see what else you could do with those networks and what was the limits, right? And then, of course, you began to see the adversaries discovering that we thought about it as how much more can we share and not so much, and now what do we need to do for security for it? So, you know, the evolution from the 90s into the 2000s was more about strapping on security and thinking about it differently. And so you end up with where you are today. One of the topics we'll probably get to is that changing environment and where it's going today. I retired from the Army about 5 years ago. I went to work with some industry partners. I don't think I realized while I was still in uniform how far behind we had gotten in the Army and in the government from industry. And since we were no longer, you know, paying so much for the R&D as we did in the 90s, then we were not, you know, cognizant of all the exciting and fantastic things going on in the Microsofts and AT&Ts and all the others of the world. So that's been an eye-opener for me. It's been a great learning experience for me. And with that, I'll pass it on. Lisa.
Great, thanks. It's really an honor to be here. I want to thank Madeline and Women in Technology Group, the WIT Group, Susie, Microsoft, and others, and all of you for being here tonight, because this is really, really cool. I actually don't live in Washington anymore and forgot that it takes like 24 hours to get 6 miles here. So I'm just happy I made it on time. So I do not miss the traffic in DC. Do not miss it. We don't have this in Delaware, so it's wonderful. So I'm delighted to be here tonight. I also came into cybersecurity in the through the Army when I was on active duty a couple years ago, times like 10 or 15. But anyway, I came in through the Army as well and was trained up on when you guys, I'm looking across the audience, so everything was, there was no LANs, there was no wireless, there was none of that. I mean, you had floppy disks this big, and even then, though, people were breaking into our computer systems. That was during the first Desert Storm, and you know, our logistics systems were already being attacked back then. So, and it's just gotten more sophisticated and more advanced as I've seen over the years. And even now, I spend time internationally, and I'm on a board of advisory board of another small company, and I just see the threats increasing, but the solutions really, and we'll talk about it more, are relatively the same as they were many, many years ago, even though the technology and the threats changed. So I look forward to talking about that. So I was in the Army, active duty for a few years, and then I went in the private sector to include Ernst & Young, and then went in the government. My last job, I retired from the government 2 years ago out of the Office Management and Budget at the White House. I was a Federal Deputy Chief Information Officer, and now I just kind of play and do fun stuff like this, but I also ran for office, so I'm an elected official in Delaware, and that's a whole different environment, worrying about a whole different environment. I will not do that again. But anyway, but worrying about the grid and, you know, what's happening at the local level, holy mackerel, if you're not thinking about that, even sitting here in Washington, please start thinking about it, because holy mackerel, again, we are so vulnerable. But that's all I'll say for now, and I'm just, again, delighted to be here and talking with you and learning from you on your questions, so thanks. Oh, my name's Lisa Schlosser, by the way. I don't know if I said that, so it's Lisa.
A picture of you, Lisa. They were lost for some. Hello, my name is. Ooh, is this on? Hello. Here. use this one? Okay. All right, one at a time. We'll pass them around. I'm Deanna Caputo. I'm pleased to be probably the non-technologist in the room. So I'm a social and personality psychologist. I work at the MITRE Corporation, which is an FFRDC, a federally funded research development center. I came to cyber coming on 12 years ago. My background was in judgment and decision making and understanding how to change attitudes and behaviors and catch people doing bad things. So I was doing psychology and law. I was a jury and trial consultant. That was a cool couple of years. And then I was recruited to the intelligence community. So I came to the government side as a senior human factors analyst, profiling nasty foreign leaders and doing social network analysis before there were easy tools. So social network analysis was a lot more manual than it is today. And then that was way too introverted for me. I am an extrovert, and sitting in front of a computer looking at human data all the time was really not the life. And so I joined the MITRE Corporation to bring to the engineering side, the human aspect side, and understanding what the humans bring. And in my first 3 months, I was asked to partake on an insider threat project. And that was my trajectory into all cyber all the time. So it started with insider threat. I've been working on insider threat all 12 years that I've been at MITRE, building indicators. So this was early user activity monitoring, which now is UBA and UEBA, like it keeps changing its name 5,000 times, but monitoring systems, right, for human activity to decide if people are doing bad things. As usual, they built the technology before they paid attention to the behaviors of, well, that's great. Now I have visibility on everything you do on a computer. Now, what does maliciousness look like in those activities, in those logs? And that's where you bring the folks to help you identify behaviors within the technology solution. So I bring a lot of R&D and structure. So we look at past data across bad guys. My movement is to move from case studies and trying to catch the last bad guy that hit the Washington Post, and find patterns across the bad guy data that we have and help us get ahead of some of those problems. I work with technology and technology solutions all the time to build stronger, more validated indicators, layering behavior onto systems, but also bring the multidisciplinary to the technology can't solve all problems, and you have users. We do a lot on usable security, trying to build user aspects and remember how users think and process information, and making sure we're taking that into account when we build tools for them to use, and when we're sad that they don't work. We build it and they don't come. Well, there's good reasons for that, and humans, I hear we're the weakest link, and so my other big message is that humans are the missing link, actually, in this problem in cyber. They're not the weakest link. We have heuristics and biases, and we hear a lot about those, and those are built for good reason, but we understand those as behavioral scientists, and we can leverage those to help ourselves, to find adversaries. There's a lot of great things that we know about human behavior that I think we're not leveraging as we're tackling cybersecurity and all the challenges that come with that. So I try to bring that perspective to the table. So I'm honored and pleased to be invited to the multidisciplinary table and talk about those things as you ask questions. So thank you for having me.
Awesome. Does this one? Oh, this one does work. Okay. Hi, I'm Susie Adams. I'm the CTO for the Microsoft Federal team, and I came to cyber a little bit differently. I grew up as a developer, supporting the federal government right when I got out of college, and about 15 years into my development career, working for a variety of different companies, Beltway Bandits, systems integrators, I started working a lot with Microsoft products, and somebody recruited me from Microsoft. So I was one of those people that actually didn't think you needed security because I was a developer, right? I was like, we don't want security. It makes it hard to write code. It's impossible, right? The users don't like the systems. It makes it cumbersome. They can't get their jobs done. And then came the cloud, right? And everybody was super afraid of what was going to happen if you put your data in somebody else's data center and were paying for it as a service, and it wasn't a GoCo or a CoCo, right? Or there wasn't some other contractual thing in place that would protect it. And I started to learn a lot about what was just discussed a few moments ago. How do we actually use big data and machine learning, artificial intelligence to look at all this signal? And what I realized is that cybersecurity wasn't what I thought it was before. The paradigm has really changed. And so I think we'll probably talk a lot about that and how it's changed and how you need to think of it very differently. For example, assume breach. Right? When you say assume breach to a government official, right, they basically say that, no, we're never going to assume breach. But that's what you have to do. Right? And that's what it's all about moving forward. We live in a perimeterless environment. Data can live on any device. So how are you going to protect that environment that has virtual boundaries and no physical perimeter with what we're used to, guards and gates and guns, and disconnect from the network? All right, so we're not actually solving the same problem we were trying to solve before, right, back 20 years ago. And so how do you do that? Right, and so it's all about a lot of the things that you just heard a second ago about how do you look at that data, how do you use the insights you get from that, how do you look at human behavior, can you tell that somebody logged in from 2 different locations to your system that's physically impossible to do and be alerted within moments, seconds, as opposed to 140 days. Right? And so that's kind of how I jumped into the cybersecurity space, is really just jumping into the cloud space.
Great. Adjusting. Let's see if this works. Oh, great. So, so the Presidential Management Agenda, or PMA, it talks a lot about public trust and trust in government services. So, if you think about government and their top priorities in cybersecurity, what's that landscape look like today?
Okay. So I don't mind taking that one first. So it depends upon the agency and the organization. It's not a cop-out, but if you're one of the civilian agencies that is very focused on that public trust and interacting through the digital era, through the cloud, through mobile devices with our citizens, which most of us do, then you're more worried about protecting that PII and where do you have your security between where the citizens interact and what you do in the back office, right? If you're not facing that piece of the public trust that has to do with their PII and you're over in the DoD, the priorities shift a little bit differently. It's about the mission systems. It's about the platforms that have been built, assuming that we had fairly good personnel security and standoff and separation that would allow, that protection. And then that's obviously, like you said, don't ever assume no breach. So that's been proven to be false, and that there are ways to attack through that. So that their priorities are significantly different than I think most of the civilian agencies worried about that public trust discussed in the PMA. But Lisa's got more experience in this.
I'd actually like Susie to go next, just because since you're living it every day, and then I'll make a couple comments.
Well, so it's kind of interesting. I think when I go out and talk to, and I support the federal government, so federal agencies, most of the times what I'm finding is people are still kind of stuck in the past. We have a lot of policies and procedures that have been written and are difficult, frankly, to update. And so when we say, hey, look, we want to use, just think it wasn't that long ago that you could only access your mail via a BlackBerry, right, in the government space. If you think about that, what is it, 10 years ago? Maybe not even that long, 5 years ago. All right, that's a huge culture shift, right? And now we're telling you the security paradigm has changed. If I were a security official who was trained back then, right, and still was responsible for protecting data and having to, comply with those mandates and those policies, it's a difficult world to navigate. And so I think what we're starting to see, which I think is really good, is that we're starting to see, OMB start to change some of those policies. People in the room familiar with the Trusted Internet Connection love Karen Evans if you're watching, but that needed to die a long time ago, and we needed to update it. Right, and really look at that new security paradigm where identity, right, is really the new perimeter. And if you can use that identity to unlock data regardless of where it lives and protect that data regardless of where it lives with more modern technology, right, you can be more secure and have better intelligence about the security posture of your networks, right, both on-premise and in the cloud and in that hybrid world. And I think there's a lot of education that probably needs to be done for folks to come up to speed, right, on these new capabilities that are out there today that allow you to gain that visibility that you didn't have before. You no longer just run a report and review it weekly, right? You actually get alerted that something bad has happened. You can go in, for example, phishing should never occur anymore, phishing attacks, ever. There is technology out there that takes that responsibility away from the end user. We can now, for example, in Office 365, you turn on this capability where when you click on a link, it goes to a detonation chamber. And if the user clicks on it, it won't, that bad behavior, it doesn't matter. They won't infect their computer. And so these are the types of things, right, where we didn't have that capability before, but now technology, and frankly, the technology that's available in the cloud to be able to collect all this signal and all this data from all these different devices and endpoints, right, in all these applications, right? Think of cloud creep, right? I call it cloud creep. So your technology that people used to install, right, without getting permission from IT. You can now, if somebody puts data in Dropbox, you can actually be alerted to that. All right, so there's all these new capabilities that I think that I look at where government is today, and we really kind of need to leapfrog the traditional learning and really start getting out in front of this, or we're going to have huge issues. I mean, it's probably going to take one bad issue, and then I think everybody will realize. And I think you're going to see has anybody read the guidance from OMB? I would love to see it right now, but I hear that it is that the way that it's going is going to be a little bit more open and allowing agencies to look at innovative solutions that are coming out on a daily basis, as opposed to being super prescriptive like we used to be.
I think
You got the bad
it doesn't work. Or I'm the user who can't work it. So MITRE sees a whole breadth of systems engineering and other problems with cyber. I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is our government sponsors trying to understand what they have and where it's at. And then identifying what's a high value asset is really much harder than it sounds. They either go from the whole gamut of everything I have is high value and super critical to, oh no, nothing I have is high value and super critical. Really? It could take down airplanes, right? That's not a problem, right? And so I think that perspective of understanding what's important that they own and the importance and the value and what to protect, but then where it's at and what it's touching. It's shocking how little some agencies know on the civilian side about where their stuff is sitting and where the interconnectedness of different things. So I think that's one big piece. We get a lot of requests right now on e-adoption. So for the public trust, a lot of civilian agents are struggling to get users, the national users, and to start using e-services, right? They don't trust that they're giving more information out, right? You already own information, so they create these new e-services, and their non-e-services, whether it's a call center or buildings, their services go up. So we got a great call about that. Like, hey, we rolled out all these new e-services. And what happened? All of our non-online services got increased, which is exactly the counter to their goals. So how do we increase that trust and confidence? And identity proofing is a big problem. So I agree that identity might be the next thing, but it's actually incredibly hard on a scale like for our government of national, whether it's taxpayers or for Social Security. That identity proofing is really complicated. People don't have a lot of the things that the government is currently requiring or standards are saying you need to have in order to identity proof. They're not comfortable giving your biometrics, but they don't have loans, or they don't have a car loan. They don't have information that's being asked, the government is asking. So the government has a big audience to fill, and figuring out how to do that, I think, is super important. And then the other last big thing we get is there's a lot of technologies out there, many vendors and tools. Which one of these really work? And how well do they work? And how well do they fit in what I have? And do I have to start all over? And so, NIST stood up the National Cybersecurity FFRDC in a goal to increase adoption of technologies in this National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, right, that sits out in Gaithersburg. So its goal is to bring some testing and evaluation and test run, right? Bring all the technology that's out there, show the government how it connects already in a live environment to get them to uptake it faster. So they're not uptaking it as fast as many in this room probably want, because they're uncertain. And there's a lot of vendor action coming at them. How do they know that it's going to do what they need it to do, and it's going to do it well, and it's not going to interrupt other services? And so MITRE has been helping with that, in helping demonstrate to the government technologies that already exist, right? We don't need to build something new. We need to show them what's out there and how they can put those pieces together with their current structure, legacy systems that are really old, that they might not be able to replace, the IT/OT problem. And so those are probably this year's big things, but we see a variety.
I agree with everything that's been said. So I'd say three things. One, I see still this need and the government putting out grants to academic institutions and really building that pipeline of cybersecurity professionals. So I still see that as a priority that the government's undertaking. I see more and more educational institutions putting in place cybersecurity programs. And I think tapping into that pipeline and encouraging that pipeline is definitely something you'll see more and more in the government, working with the private sector, both academic institutions and private sector organizations, to get that cybersecurity workforce of our next generation into both the government as well as into the public sector. So I see that as one thing. Two, when my last year in the government, we did a study and we looked at the different breaches that occurred across the government and how they occurred technically, and we found that 57% of the breaches that occurred, that were, attacks that were successful, could have been prevented or mitigated by doing one simple thing. Does anybody know what that is? Authentication, no, identity management, authentication, patching, definitely all the time, but in terms of us always, I mean, that's just a basic, right? But good try. Identity management, two-factor authentication. So if you remember nothing else I say tonight about the beach and traffic and all those other fun things, please remember that is something you can put in place and get one of the biggest returns on investment in cybersecurity and reduce your threat almost quicker than anything else. And then the third thing I see the government continuing to focus on is that fund was put into place, unless it went away in the past couple. Okay, still there. To migrate from our legacy systems, and this is where Susie was saying we have a really big opportunity to leapfrog over not just legacy technology and solutions and apps, but old cybersecurity solutions and adopt new solutions that are more effective. And I'm a big proponent of AI-based solutions. So I think that's really where we're going to go. You're seeing the government start to implement those at the endpoints to not just find the breaches that are already there, that I know are there as one who served as the acting CIO at OPM after the breach, just for the record, after the breach, I was the acting CIO. I do see that this use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, can actually help us prevent at the endpoints and not combined with better multi-factor authentication. I see us moving in those directions, and with the new policies, hopefully agencies can adopt these innovative approaches more quickly than before.
So we've talked a lot about kind of the landscape of government. One thing we do know is that we have a lot of legacy systems to modernize. So if you were to give advice, cyber is such a big topic, and we talked about authentication, we talked about identity as a new firewall and whatnot. But what are a couple of pieces of advice of where to start for these agencies?
I'll tackle that one because I think we did it when I was acting CIO at OPM after the breach. We actually, and I didn't do it, there were a lot of smart people did it, but a team of us put this together. We actually looked at every single one of our applications and where the data was and came up with a long-term modernization roadmap where we actually categorized all of our systems and applications and identified whether we wanted to modernize, replace, or retire every single application that we had in our environment, and looked at which ones we wanted to move to the cloud, when we wanted to do it. And so we had a roadmap for every one of our legacy systems at OPM, and time frames and funding as to what we wanted to do with each of those. And combined with that was a cybersecurity roadmap that we were implementing, along a long-term time frame, and that really resounded. Actually, it was DHS's idea. Margie Graves, who's now the federal, took my job. She actually came up with it, I think, first at DHS. We adopted it at OPM, and I really think that's where you have to start. That's how you get the attention of the senior leadership of the Hill, of OMB, is to show that you know where your assets are. You know what the priorities are, you know what your plan is, and you know how much it's going to cost.
Just curious, Lisa, do you see any leader in the space as far as adopting or ahead of the game?
I think DHS was, and maybe some other folks that are there every day now, but DHS was a leader, as well as OPM at the time was a leader in moving forward in that area. So hopefully there's others that are on that path now too.
Great. Anyone else have some kind of best practices as far as adopting cyber?
I won't say it's cyber. I can't agree more with what Lisa said. Going through and understanding what you have is probably the most important piece of this. I worked with a Navy group who is doing extraordinary work in this space, and they came to us and said, help, how do we go through this process? They had 65 systems of record that did the same thing with no idea which database was the authoritative database source. All right, and so when you look at how people traditionally go about this, they go and they would hire an army of consultants, and I used to be one of those consultants, that would go and talk to people and learn from the documentation and draw nice, really pretty Visio diagrams of here's how all the data interacts. You do that for about a year and a half, and you say, here's what your systems look like. And in that year and a half, all the systems have changed, all the people have moved, and you have no real clear or accurate picture of it. You don't have to do that today. You can use technology to help you understand, right, how those systems are connecting, which ones are actually being used, which ones aren't being used, right, and kind of jumpstart that whole process so that, yes, there's still a human component to this, and yes, you have to go and figure out, is the system really being used? But you can do this a lot more efficiently and effectively than you could in the past. And I think that's what we're seeing now. A lot of federal agencies start to gain momentum is they're not going back to that old school method of, hi, I'm just going to upgrade my system to upgrade my system. How many people have ever written an application, if you're a developer, and it's never been deployed? Me, I worked on it for 2 years, and we delivered it to the Navy, and it never got deployed. And that was why. All right? And so I think we're past that phase. I think people understand that now. But it's really important that the process, when they're, especially large agencies, I think smaller agencies, if you talk to Maria at SBA, it was much easier for them. They're smaller. So it took them, 8 weeks or 80 days, I think, to really understand which systems needed to go away. But that's they were kind of lucky because they were small. The larger systems, Department of Defense, I mean, some of these things, they're Model 204 mainframes. I mean, this goes back, a long way in history, and you can't just stop running everything, right? We still have to run. And so, but I think that's the right approach, and I think we're starting to see that happen across the board now.
So I think one of the best practices is one of them that Susie mentioned in the beginning when she was talking, and that is that instead of the incremental change, leapfrog, right? Admit you have a problem, right? So those DoD legacy systems that are 30 and 40 years old that have unknown data exchanges with some of the newer systems and some of the even older systems that you don't have any documentation on anywhere. You're at the point of doing that roadmap that Lisa mentioned with the technology that Susie mentioned that maps out what you really have and what the data exchanges really are, and then just admit you have a problem and go to the cloud. I mean, just let it go. I mean, I was one of the folks 7 years ago that was saying, I don't know about the cloud. This identity management, security in the cloud, how are we going to do this? Who's accessing the data? At this point, we have the technology for all that. It's the processes and the regulations and the guidelines that are so archaic that the guys can't get there from here. And so the people are learning it, the technology's there, but the processes are what really have to change at this point, in my opinion.
And continuing that, right, so on the decision-making side, cyber is finally elevating to an enterprise problem. There's still plenty of industry organizations that I engage with where cybersecurity is still not seen as a C-suite problem. It's seen as a security problem, but it's not, right? Cybersecurity isn't the thing, it's everything, and I think that that's improving, but there's still a lot of compliance-based thinking, and that's part of because it's the policy and the process. But there's still some thinking, but I do see a best practice of looking at risk-based. But that is harder to understand than people think, right? Understanding what risk means and how to think about it and what you do with it isn't something you just think about. If you just think about it, it's not practical, and technology people that lead these things don't know what to do with that, right? Okay, I'm risk thinking. What does that mean? I sit around and think about risks. But what it means is that you recognize that you're going to be attacked, and you decide your tolerance for risk. And picking your risk tolerance and understanding that concept is actually a lot harder than it sounds. And so there's still a lot of compliance-based thinking, but we see our government sponsors finally uptaking this risk notion that they're going to take risks. They can't fix everything, so they're going to have to pick what creates the most risk, tackle that, but processes and policy are still getting in the way of that, and they're still stuck with the compliance-based because they have to do that part, which is just sucking up their time to not take a risk-based approach. And so we hope to see that keep moving, but policy and process is kind of behind technology still.
And
That's being
can I add to
introduced,
that
right?
really quick? So we talked about best practices, but I couldn't say a lot about it when I was living here and working here, and especially in the government. But I think the worst practice, if anybody can jump in here and figure out ways to fix it, is the procurement process. And I know every one of you are nodding your head. Yeah, it sucks, and it really does. So and I can just say it really does. So if you have any opportunity to work on legislation to influence the federal government, OFPP, or wherever you are, to me, that is what's holding us back across the government in having the opportunity to adopt some of these really great new technologies that are out there and that the Silicon Valley folks and big companies are using across the board. It's one of the biggest barriers to us being able to innovate, and I think if folks can just somehow help us get that fixed across the board, boy, it's a big one to fix, but keep it in mind.
So it's not fixed across the board, but I've seen some light at the end of the tunnel. The authorities they gave to DHS and DoD to use the OTA, the other transactional authorities, where you can go ahead and award to 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 if you wanted to, and let them show you their capabilities through a pilot program, and then at the end of that, without having to go back through the 16-month process to award to the best of the breed. I think that is just the only way we're going to ever move forward in the technology fields, and any of them, because the technology is just changing so quickly. But it certainly applies in cybersecurity when every day there's a new type of threat actor, threat vector, threat intent and purpose. And smart people out in interesting places in our country are working on those problems. We should be able to adopt those solutions quicker, and I think those kinds of authorities are going to help us through that.
So Jennifer, you were talking about once you got out of the Army that you also had this kind of more exposure to tech, right? And I know a lot of agencies are really pushing to be able to be exposed to innovation faster and be able to ingest that into new capabilities. What can agencies do to kind of bridge that divide and be able to prepare their workforce, whether it's education or just awareness of what's possible?
When you're my age, you tend to go back to the future, right? Back when I was a lieutenant and captain, and Lisa was still in uniform, we had something called training with industry that we put a lot of resources into. And it was in the submarine making, and it was airplanes, and it was in networks, and people went to the Mobels and the AT&Ts, et cetera. We've brought some of that back, not to the element I think we need across all the agencies, where you have a chance to go spend a year with an industry that's working some hard problem that your part of the government is interested in. I also think we need to flip it and allow some of our companies to go put a person inside an agency for a year, because some of the smart, really, innovative folks out there may or may not really understand how the government works. We saw some of those challenges, and I push you to ask the DIUX lead next month, put a plug in for that, the challenges they ran into with some of the folks they brought in that had no idea how government worked, and why they got kind of stymied at the beginning of some of the things they were trying to create. So that exchange of people to understand both sides of both why there's some risk aversion inside the government for natural reasons and national security and citizens protection and that business, but also get the government guys out into industry, whether it's the acquisition guys to understand the real deal behind all those regs they make that make it so complicated, or the technical guys to understand what's next in the RF space or the next undersea unmanned vehicles. So I think that exchange of people ought to be done younger and more frequently throughout the careers.
No, I agree. Sooner
In
we
that
can do it, it's
theme
better.
of preparing the workforce, Susie, you mentioned about looking at cybersecurity and kind of how we set up cloud solutions and whatnot in a different way. Can you expand on that?
Well, from a training perspective, I think that we are seeing a lot of people come out of school with cybersecurity degrees now, and I think it's great. I have a nephew that is getting a minor in cybersecurity, and so I think we are going to see an influx of cybersecurity professionals, both women and men, join the workforce that are going to be trained in the newer technology. So I think that is going to help, especially in government. I know government has programs for that as well now, starting out, where they're going to start to hire kids right out of school to work for a couple of years and perhaps pay off their student loans, which I think is just huge, all right, to be able to do those types of things, to ingest new talent, and then if they want to stay in public service, they can, and if they don't want to, they can leave. When I think about, what we have to learn, it really just comes down to you have to embrace the fact that it's a new paradigm, right? You can't forget what you learned. You still have to protect and do defense in depth. You still have to do your network security. You still have to do multi-factor auth. That stuff didn't go away. Now there's another layer on top of that can give you better visibility, right, into all those protections and be able to see this stuff happening real time. And that's what really changed. Right? And don't be afraid to do that leapfrog from a cybersecurity perspective. I think it's super important. And I think that if the policies, which I think do really hurt us right now, can be a little bit more open and be, transparent's not the right word, but can be not as rigid and change with times and be updated more frequently as new technology rolls out, that I think government will be able to take advantage of the new capabilities just as industry has. I mean, this is not new technology for Microsoft and Amazon and Google and IBM and the Accentures of the world and the banks that are out there or the financial industry. This is already in practice. They're using artificial intelligence, big data analytics to see those bad guys, right? To see the nefarious things going on, to be able to look at not just net flow data, which is how we do things today, right? To actually look at signal at an application layer. Do you know if one of your employees is looking at a document on a friend's computer that's not protected? That's the type of things that you need to start to protect against. And if you can wrap your head around, wow, we couldn't do this before, our rules said nothing could ever go on a thumb drive, right? It is a leap. But if you can make that transition in your brain, I think that's where the cybersecurity professionals are really going to need to go to be able to advance to where we need to be, in the next couple of years.
So here I count for the non-cybersecurity workforce, which are the folks that may not be trained in cybersecurity. I think what we also want, though, is everyone to be part of the cybersecurity workforce. So I see a lot of movement, NICE, a lot of NIST programs, DHS, focusing on growing the cyber workforce, which we need, right? People that can do the technology, that can manage the cybersecurity. But what you also need is your user base to understand the value and their role, unless you find a way to make it such that they're not involved in that process, which I have yet to see, right, where that it doesn't impede, impact, or require them to do something, including patching, right? We say patching, but we usually still have to patch because we've distributed the laptops. I still have to patch, and there's MITRE's naughty list. If you're not patch compliant, you don't want to be on the naughty list, right? It goes red, yellow, green, and as you creep up, management starts beating you over the head with you're on the naughty list, get off the list. But users' security is not seen as our job, but that culture can change, right? So slips and falls are seen as our job. We notice those yellow signs. We wear seat belts now. This is not new to national government and the community. We will get used to this being part of it, but we need to not forget to start doing that culture shift now and not waiting. So we're doing it really well for our cybersecurity workforce, but we're not doing it well for our entire workforce, which is making these things part of what they think about, not necessarily part of what they do, though, right? Their primary task is to do whatever you hired them to do, not security. But being conscientious of that is just as important, right? That they put on their seatbelt, you brought them to drive, you didn't train them, we train them to do that. We train them to, wear security gear for safety. So physical security made this change. Cyber can as well, which is to pay more attention to what you click on. It'd be great if it didn't matter what you clicked on and the technology is doing those things such that it doesn't matter as much. But they should be conscientious of those things. I get the cyber hygiene. We're trying to use sort of the medical well, we do that. We get people to wash their hands more, right? And nobody washed their hands. All that's a shift. But that shift in cyber isn't actually getting a lot of emphasis. Right now, the shift is focused solely on the cybersecurity technical workforce. And so I encourage government and industry to work towards that as well by making the technology usable for users and not the everyday workforce folks, so that it doesn't seem like this wall. Right now, there's this divide where they feel like the technology is built for the security people and it's just an impediment to them and it's a burden. That is changing and that is getting better, but it needs to keep getting better, that their requirement to do that, and then changing that thinking that we're all part of cybersecurity.
So I want to pile on a little bit. Like Lisa said, once you retire and you leave DC area and you live someplace else, I live in South Carolina, you get a little bit different view of what's going on. And I was speaking to a gentleman who may still be here from the Washington, D.C. school district. Is he still here or did he head out? Okay, there he is. Okay. And he's focusing in on working on educating in the K through 12 with cybersecurity and developing STEM programs for young ladies. Down where I live in South Carolina, we're really close to Fort Gordon, Georgia. And for the y'all that don't know, that's where Army Cyber Headquarters is moving to in 2020. So 2 years ago, the 7-county area said, hey, how are we going to be ready to feed this workforce so they don't have to bring in, foreigners from outside of South Carolina, Georgia, and come take the great jobs, right? So we want to be able to hire local, and to do that, you have to up the school system. Georgia and South Carolina weren't known to have the great schools of Northern Virginia or Maryland. So they really started putting some real emphasis into the school systems, and starting with the high school and moving through the junior high and now into the elementary school, of exactly what you said. Cyber consciousness at the beginning, when you're first starting to touch your first electronic devices, and really understanding how these things communicate between each other. And it's paying dividends. And so now the community colleges have programs set up for those that want to do the hands-on piece. The local university, like UMUC does, has got a bachelor and master's program now in cybersecurity and moving into cyber operations as its next program. So it can be done at the local level, and it should be done at the local level, I believe, with the investments and the understanding from the community of how it's important. Even the Medical College of Georgia has a separate program on, cybersecurity in medicine. That's just phenomenal. If you had told me 10 years ago that was going to happen, like you, I'd have said, yeah, right, they're going to strap on a firewall at the edge of the hospital or something, right? And it's just not true. Everything, Internet of Things affects everybody, and so you're seeing more and more of that. Probably Microsoft guys in the room can tell you more about it. That consciousness that we're all connected, whether we want to be or not, and the fact that means we all have to be conscious about the security of what we're doing. Long answer, sorry.
What comes to mind when you say that is critical infrastructure. We haven't really talked about that. And where do we stand on that as a country? And how does that factor in, especially in this theme of cybersecurity?
I'll start with that. I mean, I'm seeing that now. I got my first tour of a water treatment plant. If you've never done that, you should do that. I mean, it is really fascinating to know where that water comes and where that water goes, I guess, underneath your city. It's fascinating. And to see really how vulnerable those plants are is quite terrifying, to be honest, if we're not paying attention to this. I went to, one of the things I did this morning is went to Montgomery County, just announced that they put in place what they call a microgrid system for better resilience, and cybersecurity is actually built into that. So there's a whole methodology now for better protecting our grids by segmenting the grid. So right now in most states, counties, cities, if one part of your power grid goes down, everything goes down, right? So you're now moving toward these smart grids. And so I think getting awareness, not just at the federal level, but at the federal level, working in partnership with state, local, utility companies is absolutely critical at this point. We have a path forward on how we can start to protect critical infrastructure. And by the way, in the past 2 years, that to me is what people say, what do you lose sleep over? That is totally what I lose sleep over, is we are so vulnerable, and it is the thought of our power grid going down or our telecommunications grid going down for an extended period of time, what would we do? To me, that we should all be thinking about it and looking to move our communities, both with our federal or our private sector hats on, for those of you that are here in technology, but also as, in your community, kind of understanding what's happening with your local government and getting involved and getting information out that, boy, guys, we need to be thinking about this and we need to be adopting things like Montgomery County just put in place to protect the grid. So yeah, it's a big deal, but there's ways forward, and it's encouraging to see that in this area.
Great. Well, I'd love to open the questions to the floor for those who are attending. So I don't know if there are any questions from everybody. Oh, we got one here.
Thank you. Thanks. My name is Bob, and my question is for General Napper. I guess it's a beautiful place you live in near Augusta, right? So with Army Cyber and looking at the Army's point of view, and really it's really a question that anybody could answer. With artificial intelligence and all of the devices we have, the smart devices and smart cars and smart everything, all this data is being collected. And it's a lot of data, it's a lot of personalized data where, it pretty much knows from your Easy Pass where you're driving, what you're doing, where you're going, what you've done, how long you've been on the internet, what you're looking at, and all of these personal items now that it seems like are being collected, and then wondering what is that, where's the line being drawn, and how do you protect that data without being invasive into somebody's personal life?
So this is really one of those great privacy versus security versus who owns the data kind of questions, right? So the Army doesn't have a perspective on that because our Army data is Army data, period. So that's not an Army issue. But it is a citizen issue. And so from that perspective, I would like to know, exactly where does the little report from my car go off to when I say, yeah, sure, send it, right? And I have no knowledge. And so what did it really collect? Does it know? Every mile I put in and how much gas all that. I don't know. We have begun to trust our industrial partners that collect that data to only do what they're supposed to do with it. We had some, I don't mean to get on a soapbox, but we had some eye-opening experiences when some of that trust was broken through some of the social media organizations, right? When we found out other things were being done with that data. And then they had to make public where you could check off ads and no ads and what data could be sent outside of what you opted for. So I do think it is a significant challenge coming forward that this is one area I do think legislation and awareness campaigns are going to be necessary to really work hard on. What data do you not care? I don't really care if they know how much I put in the gas tank, but what data do I care about, and what do I think I should have control over where it goes that's my data? Maybe someone that worked more on the policy side would like to weigh in.
So on the privacy and use, I think there's a lot of science that says, though, that how we're framing the opportunities that are being open, where we're trying to explain to users how their data are not understood. So there's lots of good research showing that we can show you those and we can tell you to click those boxes, but they don't understand the ramifications of any of that, to be very honest. And there's like science and studies and good data being done. So we're trying to figure out the best way to frame that. But people are not paying attention to the edge cases and the use cases, or stalking is a really great example of the misuse of all of that information. It is so much easier now to stalk a human being, and it's being done at the rate of stalking is going up, and your ability to get away from your stalker and move on is also going up because they can find you wherever you're going. And so we need to figure out which of those use cases are going to get through to the public to understand the risk that they're putting themselves at as well, besides giving them a privacy notice and asking them to check boxes, or that your smart refrigerator information will go to your life insurance company, and because you eat pizza and beer every single day, maybe we should make your premiums higher. I mean, that sounds crazy, but that is a perfectly logical future use of your data that you probably haven't even thought about when you talk to people that have all this stuff in their house. That's all. I have none of it. So I will proudly say I have none of that. I have no smart anything in my house, and I don't want that because I don't want to worry about it, but it is going to happen. But how do we make them really understand the potential repercussions of that data? We're having trouble figuring out how to communicate it even to users, much less to technologies of, do you really need to keep that data? It can collect it for its purpose, but how much do you keep in store? And that's...
So,
It could have, right, yeah.
So this is a super important issue, and I think, I agree. I know Microsoft agrees that there needs to be legislation about this, especially as we get into more complex technologies like artificial intelligence and others. But I mean, privacy is a fundamental human right, right? And it just depends on the company on whether they have those principles in place to believe that that's a fundamental human right. Right? Do they define what constitutes customer data versus what they're willing to collect? Do they anonymize that data? Right? And this is where I think, from a citizen perspective, it gets difficult, especially with free services that are available out there. Do you go and read the fine print? All right? No. I mean, how many times do you click on something and then you're like, oh, wait a minute, I'm seeing ads now that are appearing everywhere, right? And then and I think that is a huge problem. How do you educate people on that? But I do think as we become more intelligent about this, I know on the enterprise side of things, right, our customers are demanding that we tell them where their data is, exactly which data we're keeping, for how long we're keeping it for, and what we're using it for. Right? And we actually have guidelines and training. I mean, it's exhaustive. We have people that go and look at the data to make sure it's not being used. It's a fireable offense if they find out that you've looked at any PII data without the customer's response. But those are all things we've had to put in place. Right? And it wasn't a small thing to do. And it's one of the core principles. And it is, if you go and talk to any of the other large companies, they're also doing similar things. But I think it's going to be important that we have legislation in place that if people do use it inappropriately, that there's a consequence. Right? And until that happens, I think we're still always going to be at risk. And, from a training perspective, I'll tell you, in the last 5 years, we used to go out and talk to high schools about this challenge, and especially about using Facebook. And I remember telling my nieces and nephews, right, they were posting things on Facebook, and I'm like, do you really want to get a job when you graduate from college? Because they look at your Facebook. And my niece was like, no way. And I was like, yeah, way. And so to get into college, she had to go to an interview. She's an architect now, and they absolutely looked at her Facebook. She was mortified. Now, luckily, we were monitoring her Facebook, and we made her remove things that were inappropriate, for a kid, a high school kid. But we went through this whole presentation to these guys, to an all-boys high school, and I asked them questions. How many people have posted a picture of you hanging out with the boys on a sleepover that wasn't sanctioned? Right? How many people have done X, right? And then I said, then we'd put up news articles of people not getting into military academies, not getting into Harvard, not being accepted into med school because of something they did when they were a sophomore in high school. Right? And so I do think there's an educational, that was a very simple explanation of this, but then the whole, if you're being stalked, don't check in everywhere. You have to teach people not to do this, and I think that's I think the challenging part about it is, how do you get that message out there? And I think training at the younger ages, right? And I know I don't want a refrigerator that knows what's in my fridge all the time, so until there's legislation in place.
Hello, my name's Mike Williams. I'm from World Military Academy, a MOOC. About 5 years ago, they came out with a program called Dysphoria, which basically allowed you to put your information on a node that would share with other social networks and other people the types of privileges that you would extend to Facebook, Instagram, and all that. I'm just amazed that you even actually know young people that use Facebook. But anyway,
Hey.
But because many of the companies are going to change their policies regardless of whether or not that was the original agreement, and then they've done a little bit of social creep, and but if all the information was held on your personal node in the cloud, so to speak, and you had all the permissions, you were completely aware of everything that happens, whether your postings, may affect your employment or your social life or whatever, you would be set. And then if a group came and tried to get more information, they would be denied. And then if you decide you don't like that social network, you leave and they get amnesia and they go, what was their information? We don't have it anymore.
That's awesome. That's
It's called dysphoria.
I think it's a great idea, actually.
Hi, good evening. So my question is not tech related. It's more on the leadership side for the women on the panel. So being leaders in industry that are not typically, don't typically have women at the head, or what's your advice or your best advice that helped you to actually get the respect of your team and to get their support throughout the journey, kind of being an anomaly at the time when you were at the heads?
Since I guess I'm the old one on the panel, I'll start it. No, seriously. In the Army, we take leadership very seriously. From the beginning, you're put into situations to train you to be a good leader and to learn your limits and to learn the limits of your people and to build teams. The best advice I would give anybody, male or female, woman or gentleman, is simply be yourself. Know your strengths and your weaknesses, and always look for how to build the team based upon their strengths and weaknesses. In the Army, you can't just fire people and get someone new. You have to build the team with who you have. And so it's a matter of building up their confidence, building up their strengths, and then balancing those weaknesses on the rest of the team. So knowing yourself and your own strengths and weaknesses, and don't try to be somebody else. Trying to be somebody else, you will fail. I do believe that you continue to grow as a leader as you see examples of both good and bad leadership, things that you do want to learn and take and put in your kit bag, and some things that you don't ever want to emulate. And number one in mind is the respect for yourself and your people. So that's...
I think it was, I call myself like a Title IX baby, which means basically that I was the first group of women going through high school where Title IX applied. So there was no limitations. That was the beginning. I mean, and I think sports taught me at least the foundational characteristics that helped me move up in my career, both in the Army and in the private sector. And that was just these simple things: teamwork, integrity, discipline, and always enhancing your skills. So I think those apply to women and men. Came to me through sports, but I think anybody that can study leadership, and I've also evolved over time. I was not a good leader when I was a second lieutenant in the Army. I was not. I mean, at all. I had so many old grizzled sergeants pull me aside and say, "Look, Lieutenant, I don't care if you outrank me. You don't do that again." I learned a lot, and so I think that continuously assessing yourself, taking a hard look at what people, how they perceive you, both people that work for you, with you, above you, across, your partners. I think you have to do that throughout your career and take that hard criticism and get better based on hearing that hard criticism. So it's just a couple of my thoughts.
I have not risen as high as any of these lovely women here, but I, am moving up the levels at MITRE. MITRE's, primarily a systems engineering company, so I'm not only an anomaly as a female, but I'm an anomaly as I'm not an engineer. And I think all the things about just being a good leader and sort of being your authentic self are really valuable. What I see most in other females that are not moving also, though, is also being heard. So not waiting for someone to ask you your thoughts and opinions and the skill you bring. So knowing what you're good at is really important to doing that, though, right? So it doesn't mean speaking up at every instinct and impulse. It means having something smart to say, planning that ahead, but not waiting for someone to ask you, what is it that you think? And sitting in the back row and being demure, right? And that doesn't also mean taking over the room and taking control of everything. It means finding that sweet spot that you're comfortable with, but you have to give yourself a reason to stand out and speak up. And so as I'm growing folks on my team, what I see a lot is them sitting quietly, and that doesn't help us both as behavioral scientists to be heard at a sea of engineers, but it also doesn't help them as women to be stood out for the technology, what they bring, the skill they have. You have to show people, just like everybody else, every other gender, race, you have to show people what you know and what you can do and how you can help and what value you add. And so reflect on what it is you add value in and be proud of that, but also take opportunities that are provided to you, even if they don't seem like great opportunities at the time. And pretty much everything in life is all about networking. And I don't mean just names, but it's networking and sharing what you know, learning paying attention to others, meeting other folks, and moving forward is really about networking.
Yeah, I agree with everything that everybody said up here, and I actually agree that finding that sweet spot for knowing when to speak in meetings, and especially, I can't tell you how many times I've been in a room where there's, 20 gentlemen and myself, and I'm trying to figure out how to be heard. And what do I say that will be heard in a strong way, but yet not too challenging, and right, what's that sweet spot to make sure that I'm adding value and not coming off too strongly. Right, to just try to be heard. And I think that is one of the hardest things I've had to learn throughout my career. And like Lisa, sports is kind of how I got a lot of my teamwork and leadership skills. And the one thing that I'm pretty much what you see is what you get, so authenticity comes without me thinking about it because I only have one me. And so I think that too is, knowing your strengths and weaknesses, what you're not good at, and then also knowing your teams. I've watched too many other leaders really try to put round pegs in square holes with people where they say, I need this resource, that person isn't that resource, therefore they're not good. And that's not the case. And I think that I've watched too many really, really strong, especially in the technical field, technical people who just, they just had a different personality. And if you look at all the people in your team, you can figure out how to piece that puzzle together so that everybody's adding value and that you can get to where your team needs to get to. And I really think that takes work. That's not, you got to get to know that person. You got to get to know where they want to go with their career, what they want to do, what they're good at, what they're not good at, what they want to be good at, right? And that's kind of, a lot of people don't want to put in that time. They say they want to be a manager and they want to rise up the ranks, but that's not a leader. A manager's not a leader, right? Anybody can be a leader. You don't have to have direct reports, right? And so I think that's the other important part of that.
Well, thank you, ladies, for joining us tonight. This was an amazing discussion and very valued. For those who still have questions, we had a lot of hands tonight, we have some networking towards the end of the session. So thank you so much.